So yes, today we're getting into the stuff that, I don't know, might be the stuff that you probably really wanted to learn when you thought about coming to this class. We're going to be defining critical race theory, defining intersectionality, white privilege, white fragility, all these terms that are thrown around today. And I would probably say that 90% of the content tonight will actually be direct quotations, and mainly direct quotations from the people who have been propagating the social justice agenda and the social justice ideology. Basically because people can make the accusation, oh, you're only referencing or you're only studying Christian resources that are talking about the primary resources. And so to protect us from that, we're going to actually engage with the primary resources. So I did the due diligence of buying these books and giving these people money. And yeah, I know. So I bought these books. These books that we're specifically going to be pulling from, you've probably heard of them before. One of them is called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It's the #1 best-selling book, New York Times best-selling book. It's being used to create public school curriculum. You maybe heard of the book, White Fragility. It's been around for a while now. Again, a New York Times best-selling book. Robin DiAngelo is consulted often in universities and public schools for content on these things. Another book, which is more academic, it's just called Critical Race Theory. It's by a few of the scholars that founded critical race theory. And so it's more of the technical side of what critical race theory is and how it was formulated, and a couple other books that we'll pull from. So it's going to be pretty much entirely quotations. So it's going to be me reading a lot of things, but it should be good. And I got some good graphics in here too that should help space it up. If we need more chairs, which I think we do, we might have to just do that right now before we start. Oh, that's fine. Do we got enough? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chairs. And we should be good. Yep, we're good. Okay. One review slide from last week. It's not on your notes. If you guys remember, we ended with the new morality. If you remember, we kind of ended with this hegemony thing. This idea, again, hegemony are these things that are associated with the dominant group or the group in power. So whether it was logic or mathematics, whatever it is that's associated with the group in power, that's the hegemonic power structures that need to be overturned. And so, again, the new morality, any action that seeks to create equality of outcome and overthrow hegemonic power structures is the new morality. That is, again, this is social justice. So again, I kind of said, like, if burning and looting, because it adopts this Marxist, utilitarian, pragmatic ethic, if burning and looting a store is thought to overthrow the hegemony, the hegemonic power structure, it's just and it's right, it's moral. As it pertains to the white hegemony, the work of anti-racism is the new morality. So we, again, as whites, we're all white in here. If we are to be just or do some type of justice in the society, our job is to do the work of anti-racism, and we need the help of CRT and intersectionality to do the work of anti-racism and to become woke. So we're going to look at a little bit of some graphics that I actually found on Facebook, probably a year and a half ago now, when things were really starting to heat up in this whole topic of social justice. Somebody posted this graphic, this picture of justice, and I thought it was like, oh yeah, that is a great description of the world's idea of justice, of social justice. So the first one is this: inequality, unequal access to opportunities. So obviously you see, the tree's tilted. The one side of the tree has all the apples, the other side has barely any, and one person's getting apples and one person is not, and that is inequality, unequal access to opportunities. And obviously, we can kind of miss the point if we think too much about just food. So, everybody should at least have food. Obviously, remember we said that there's this idea of it's not unconditional. If you don't work, you don't eat. If you're able to work and you don't, you shouldn't be able to eat. Paul said that's a commandment that he gave the Thessalonians. So we have to nuance this a little bit. So think of the apples as more of like resources, financial resources, things like that. Then you have equality, ? Evenly distributed tools and assistance. Okay, now they have equal-sized ladders. Oh, isn't that nice? But nope, ? Equity, custom tools identify and address the inequality. So this is a big thing today. Reparations, all these things that bring people to even spots. But there's still this kind of glaring thing in the eyes of the world today. And then we have justice. Fixing the system. So obviously it's all about the system. It's all about the policies. It's all about the state and the government. Fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. But the thing about this is, like, it doesn't, keep in mind, it doesn't address, like, what type of people these two people are. Is there something actually morally wrong about one of them over the other one? And it could very well be that the one on the left was actually a wicked person and got what they got, unjustly. But again, in this whole idea of social justice, the moral characteristics of somebody, truly like a Christian moral, Christian virtue, the Christian heart, those things aren't considered at all. That's just out of bounds. You're not even thinking about it. It's exclusively about just what you have, and everybody needs to have total equality. So this is, again, justice in the social justice movement. So woke, basically two definitions. Awakened, to be woke is to be awakened to the reality of power dynamics. So be awakened to the reality of oppressors and oppressed. So to be woke as a white person means you recognize that you are an oppressor simply by the color of your skin. And that you realize that you have oppressed people and that you are in privilege. And now, obviously, the next step of that is to do the work of anti-racism, which we'll get into pretty in-depthly coming up here. It's also, you're alert to injustice in society, especially racism. So that's actually Oxford Language's dictionary definition of it. Alert to injustice in society, especially racism. That's what it means to be woke. And so the ideological tools of anti-racism and wokeism actually isn't even, I don't think, considered a word yet, but it soon will be. But it is certainly a word that's being used a lot. The worldview, the ideology of wokeism. Again, the two tools that you need to use are intersectionality and critical race theory. So intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw was the progenitor. Maybe you've heard that name, Kimberly Crenshaw. There's a picture of her. First introduced intersectionality in a polemical 1989 scholarly law paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist policies. And it gained further clarity, this idea of intersectionality gained further clarity in her 1991 essay, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. So that is one of the most famous academic journal articles that has been written on this whole topic of intersectionality and critical race theory and things like that, and the whole social justice movement. Maybe you have read it before, I don't know, but it is a very, very, very key article in this whole timeline of this movement. So a little bit more about intersectionality. Crenshaw defines it as a provisional concept linking contemporary politics with postmodern theory. So again, that's why we went through postmodernism and the worldview of postmodernism, because the people that are coming up with these ideas that are being employed today, they consider themselves postmodernists. They pull directly from postmodern theory and the postmodern worldview. So that's why we needed to understand that whole idea of language and social construction and local knowledge and this standpoint epistemology. I know what I know simply by what I feel and from my standpoint in the world, and I can't really critique anybody else's standpoint. So all these things are starting to be employed, and so as we start to go through some of these quotations, keep your eyes out for these postmodern themes and also these Marxist themes as well. So since people find themselves in more than one victim group, intersectionality is a method used to define someone's victim and oppressed level. So the more intersections of oppression someone finds himself in, the more innocent they are and the more secret knowledge, back to that idea of local knowledge, secret knowledge, they possess, because they can identify now in different groups. And basically the way she thought about it and the way she described it is literally being at like the middle of an intersection, a street intersection, and you can get hit with oppression from 4 different angles depending on how many groups you identify with. So that's kind of the picture that she's having here, is you can get hit by all these different oppressive realities depending on how many groups you identify with. So some people could, be oppressed in 2 ways, some people in 5 ways. And so we're gonna look at some a table here coming up soon, but here's a big quote from Mapping the Margins, that famous article. She says, "We all can recognize the distinction between the claims, 'I am black,' and the claim, 'I'm a person who happens to be black.' 'I am black' takes a socially imposed identity and empowers it as an anchor of subjectivity. 'I am black' becomes not simply a statement of resistance, but also a positive discourse of self and of identification. Intimately linked to celebratory statements like the black nationalist, 'Black is beautiful,' 'I am a person who happens to be black,' on the other hand, achieves self-identification by straining for a certain universality. In effect, 'I am first a person,' and for a concomitant dismissal of the imposed category black as contingent, circumstantial, or non-determinate." So again, what she's basically saying is the most fundamental aspect to her identity is her black skin color, her black identity, not her personhood. And that's the case because, again, the whole idea of universality and transcendent objective reality is denied by postmodernism. There is no objective reality. There is no transcendent reality. There is no universality. So this idea of personhood, as though we all are universally persons by some objective transcendent standard, that's foreign to postmodernism. It's obviously foreign to her idea of intersectionality and her idea of identity. What's fundamental in her identity is her identity group, which is her being a black woman. So you can see that clearly in that quote. Here is a table of intersectionality. So you got two sides, the oppressed groups, the oppressor groups. I'll give us some time here because I gave you a blank table. But this is just the way it is. Like the oppressed group, female. The oppressor group, male. The oppressed group, minorities. Obviously, oppressor group, white. You got LGBTQIA+. What is the oppressor group? The heterosexual and the cisgender. You got Muslim as oppressed group. The oppressor group is Christian. And that is just so interesting. So interesting because when you look at the Islamic culture, and especially the Islamic states that are ruled by Sharia law or whatever, like they are the most oppressive people, especially towards women. Like they just objectively are. And so it's really interesting that in America, at least, the Muslim would be considered the oppressed group and the Christian the oppressor. And it's obviously because Christian is the dominant, the dominant religion in America, and it was really the religion and the faith that really founded America, and obviously America in the law system and the Constitution. Everything was very much intertwined in a Judeo-Christian worldview. So obviously, Christianity has been married to the dominant group, the power group, the people that are in power. So obviously it's automatically an oppressor group versus the Muslim or any other religious group that is less or inferior. The immigrant is an oppressed group. The U.S. born is oppressor. The inner city can be considered, if you're from the inner city, you can be considered an oppressed group. If you're from suburban or rural areas, you can be an oppressor group. Broken home, two-parent home, again, a really interesting thing because we would say that coming from a two-parent home is a great thing. That's good, that's biblical, that's right, that's just. There's something really awesome about that, and it creates amazing benefits for children as they are raised. But because there's such great benefits to it, and it puts you at an advantage over people that are in a broken home, you're now considered an oppressor. Uneducated versus educated, obviously, poor versus rich, and this is an interesting one, fat versus skinny, or in shape. There's a huge movement right now of this whole, basically, I don't know, it might be just called fat theory. A part of, like, you can think of critical race theory, you can think of queer theory, all these different theories. You actually have like a fat type theory where people who are overweight are oppressed because of their weight. They're not getting as many opportunities. People don't think they're as attractive, whatever it is. But again, when you think about that, obviously there can be some things that determine if you're overweight or not. But fundamentally, though, we would say that we need to steward our bodies and take care of our bodies. So again, it falls really kind of outside of the whole idea of Christian stewardship. So that's the intersectionality table. You guys all got it written down? Good? Awesome. Okay. Here is this is interesting. I acquired this from a source I will not say. This is a worksheet given over Zoom, because it was during COVID, from a Minneapolis public school system, middle school class. The name of the instructor was on it. I cut it off, so I know who she is. It's a girl. But again, here's this is public school system curriculum. Look at the intersectionality. Types of oppression: racism, sexism, religious oppression, heterosexism, and xenophobia. Privilege groups: white, male, Christian, Protestant. They even got specific. Heterosexuals and U.S. born. I am in every single one of those categories. Targeted groups: people of color, black, Asian, native, Latino, female, Muslims and others, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, immigrants, documented or undocumented. And so then the question is, how does it feel when you think about being in each of these groups, privileged and targeted? And so again, this is actually very common. This is in the school systems around the country. That's why you go on the news and you see constant clips of parents going to the school board freaking out over the critical race theory and the intersectionality being put into the school system. It's like every day you see a new video of this. I just saw another one on Facebook today. It was fantastic. It was a black couple laying out how BLM and critical race theory is evil. It's phenomenal. So this is in the school system, and to act like it's not is just crazy. We got to understand this. But yeah, it's blatant. It's there. So you're getting. You're supposed to feel a guilt of just simply being, white, male, a Christian, a heterosexual. Lots of the heterosexual and a Christian, that is right. Obviously, that's right. You can't control if you're male or female. You can't control if you were U.S. born or not. You can't control any of these things. I mean, really, it's just unbelievable. Okay, critical race theory. Okay, there's going to be a lot of stuff here. A lot of big block quotes. Some of them are going to be in your notes. I left a big open space because some of these big block quotes I wasn't going to put on there and just take up too much space. So you can just jot down things that you would want to jot down from these big block quotes. Otherwise, you don't have to if you don't want to. So just a few kind of preliminary things on it. Race is a social construct, again, very postmodern, that was created to maintain white privilege and white supremacy. The term critical means that its intention and methods are specifically geared toward identifying and exposing problems in order to facilitate revolutionary political change. So notice the revolutionary political change. It's very much, there is action in critical race theory. It's not just this boring, no action, no purpose type of thing. No, they're embedded within critical race theory is this idea of revolution, really, overthrowing the power structures. It is revolutionary, political change. It's dangerous. That's why we see the crazy looting and rioting and the burning down of cities. It actually has a goal, and people are doing the goal. They're doing this. Critical race theorists tend to lean either more Marxist or more postmodern, so there's a little bit of a spectrum, which is interesting, because remember what I said, Marxism and postmodernism they should be oil and water. They should be. They're not complementary at all, but with that reality, though, you'll see some people be more on the Marxist side of it and some people be more on the postmodern side of it. So the Marxists prioritize the economic differences, because obviously that's what Marx prioritized between races, while the postmodernists focused on the use of white language as the means of oppression. Again, remember how postmodernism was all about language? The postmodernists focus on things like microaggressions, hate speech, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, implicit association tests, media representation, and whiteness. And microaggressions, maybe you've heard that term before, basically anything that could offend somebody. I think a friend of mine went to the doctor. The doctor was just making casual conversation with him. I think it was this question. He asked him where he grew up. And he goes, "Oh, I wasn't supposed to ask you that. We just had a training, and that's considered a microaggression." Because if you grew up impoverished or in the inner city or wherever it might be, you could feel a sense of inferiority because of that. And so to even ask that question of where you're from is a microaggression. So the postmodernists will kind of drift more that way, the language game type of thing. So there's two kind of big assumptions with critical race theory. The first one is positionality, the idea that one's position within society as determined by group identity dictates how one understands the world and will be understood in it. Very postmodern. Again, that's standpoint epistemology to a T. That's this idea of local knowledge again. Racism is prejudice plus power. This is big, therefore only white people can be racist, which is convenient, since CRT is blatantly racist towards white people. So you can't actually be racist unless you are the group that has been deemed in power. So that's why there is no idea of reverse racism in CRT. 4 basic tenets to CRT. Now this is all direct quotations from the book Critical Race Theory by Delgado and Stefanik, I think his name is, whatever that is. Whatever. So, first one is this. Racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Remember, these are direct quotes. 2, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group. So a couple finer nuances or points underneath point number 2. Might be a little small. The first feature, ordinariness, it's a technical term, means that racism is difficult to address or cure because it is not acknowledged. Colorblind or formal conceptions of equality expressed in rules that insist only on treatment that is the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining or immigration dragnet in a food processing plant that targets workers, or the refusal to hire a black PhD, rather than white colleague or college dropout, which stand out and attract our attention. So ordinariness. So the basic idea is that, most of the racism that goes on in society is kind of under the surface, and you don't really notice it, and it's kind of subconscious type things. The second feature, sometimes called interest convergence or material determinism, adds a further dimension because racism advances the interests of both white elites materially and working class white psychically. Large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate it. So that's interest convergence. 3, the social construction thesis. It holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations, not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. People with common origins share certain physical traits, of course, such as skin color, physique, and hair texture. Again, there are some grains of truth in this, certainly. But these constitute only an extremely small portion of their genetic endowment, are dwarfed by what we have in common, and have little or nothing to do with distinctly human, higher-order traits, such as personality, intelligence, and moral behavior. That society frequently chooses to ignore these scientific truths, creates races, and endows them with pseudo-permanent characteristics is of great interest to critical race theory. So a lot of that is actually true. This idea that race isn't necessarily the subjective thing. It is kind of a construction in a sense. So I like John MacArthur's quote, "A broken clock is right 2 times a day." And anything that is just blatantly false in every way doesn't often get adopted into a society. There has to be grains of truth to kind of, the poison pill that's covered with sugar or something, or put butter on a pill to give when you feed your dog or whatever if you need to give medicine. And that's the reality. You think of Satan too. He masquerades around as an angel of light to deceive people. So there are going to be aspects of truth. But again, this is obviously coming from a very postmodern idea, though, which is kind of feeding into this social construction idea, that everything is socially constructed. Differential rationalization. So this is underneath point number 3. The dominant society racializes different minority groups at different times in response to shifting needs such as labor market. So differential racialization. Here we go. Intersectionality and anti-essentialism. Essentialism. It's actually not a word because the word check did not like that I spelt it that way, but that's how it's spelled apparently. No person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. A white feminist may also be Jewish or working class or a single mother. An African-American activist may be male or female, gay or straight. A Latino may be a Democrat, a Republican, or even black, perhaps because that person's family hails from the Caribbean. An Asian may be recently arrived Mon Hmong or a rural background and unfamiliar with mercantile life, or a fourth-generation Chinese with a father who is a university professor and a mother who operates a business. Everyone has potential conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. That's intersectionality. So intersectionality is a fundamental tenet of critical race theory. A unique voice of color. Coexisting in somewhat uneasy tension with anti-essentialism, the voice of color thesis holds that because of their different histories and experiences with oppression, Black, American, Indian, Asian, and Latino writers and thinkers may be able to communicate their white counterparts to their white counterparts matters that the whites are unlikely to know. Minority status, in other words, brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. And so that, again, is the idea of local knowledge, standpoint epistemology, totally applied. And this gets really, we're going to look at this next week, but this gets really bad when it's obviously applied to how we read the Bible, because the issues of injustices and justice in the Bible is considered to be, white people are considered to be unable to really understand what the Bible's teaching about this, because we can't see these things. We don't have this secret knowledge. We don't identify with oppressed groups, so we can't actually interpret Scripture properly in that regard. And that is being applied in hermeneutics all the time today, and Bible interpretation. So the legal storytelling movement urges Black and brown writers to recount their experiences with racism and legal system and to apply their own unique perspectives to assist law's master narrative. So, and obviously you hear this all the time, just, white people are said, just listen. Ask about their experiences. Let them tell you what they've gone through. Don't question it. Just listen and just affirm it. Because we have no ability to critique that local knowledge because of postmodernism again. Here's a few more quotes from Critical Race Theory, the book. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists with CRT's, you're supposed to be either, whatever. CRT's idea is to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies over curriculum and history, bilingual and multicultural education, and alternative and charter schools. So, obviously, they're saying it's being applied into the school system. It is, in every way. Another quote from Bell and Stefanik. Unlike other academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. Again, there's action behind it. There's a goal. Here's Derek Bell. He is actually the progenitor of critical race theory. He's the one that founded it. Delgado, the other guy I mentioned, he was one of the original guys, a part of it, though. Certainly a part of that group, that main scholar group. Oh, man, I went backwards. Okay. Known for interest convergence, the idea that whites have only allowed rights to Black people when it was in their interest to do so. It's a very interesting assumption. It is a dismissal idea, which basically says that no progress has actually been made in racial justice. Because any perceived progress is actually just a part of interest convergence. It's just like, oh, well, whites just allowed it just because of their own interest. They gave a little because they have this, they might not even be consciously understanding the fact that they're still seeking their own gain in every way. So it's totally a dismissal idea. You can't prove it. He says this: progress in America-race relation is largely a mirage, obscuring the fact that whites continue, consciously or unconsciously, to do all in their power to ensure their dominion and maintain their control. Direct quote from him. That's why often we wonder, man, the way I see it, there has been great progress in this whole issue of racial reconciliation and racial injustice, given the fact that yeah, there was wicked, horrible slavery happening, in American history. Absolutely. And there was Jim Crow, which was wicked and horrible and truly racist. And there has been great progress. So the fact that he is saying that there's really been no progress, and it's only been an aspect of this interest convergence. It's just really quite crazy. And that's why when people talk about how racist America is, a lot of people can be very confused. Like, what are you talking about? Or that there's been no progress. What are you talking about? Well, this is why they say that, because it comes from this idea of interest convergence. So, to the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, we're going to spend a lot of time here. The nice thing about Ibram X. Kendi is that he really likes clear definitions, which is really, really helpful. He has all these definitions in the beginning of his book, and we're just going to list them all off. So there's no hidden stuff here. Definitions, lots of them. Racist. How does he define racist? One who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. Again, all about policy. It's not, a racist is not somebody that actually thinks somebody is inferior. It's just about policy. Anti-racist. One who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Race. A power construct of collected or merged differences that lives socially. Very postmodern. Racism. A marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. So fundamental to racism is inequity. I'm going to keep going. Racial inequity. When two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. Keep in mind that there is no more questions asked. It's purely, are these two people, a white person and a black person, on equal footing? It does not matter if they have made vastly different decisions in their life individually, because the individual does not matter to anti-racism and to critical race theory and to postmodernism. Everybody is a part of the group. The individual does not exist. So those types of questions are not asked, ever. You will not see it. It's all about the product. Are these people on equal footings? Racial equity, when two or more racial groups are standing on relatively equal footing. Racist policy, any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. Again, regardless, doesn't matter if people have made drastically different decisions in life, which obviously makes it hard to determine if the policy is actually racist or producing the inequity. Anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. So by policy, Kendi means written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. What we would think of as policy. Pretty straightforward. Racial policies have been described by other terms. Maybe you've heard these terms before. Institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. So, racial discrimination, another definition, is an immediate and visible manifestation of an underlying racial policy. So, keep in mind, think about that definition for a moment. How we would usually think about racial discrimination is somebody treating somebody like badly or sinfully based upon the color of their skin. Like thinking of them inferior and you superior by the color of their skin. That's not it at all. It's a manifestation of an underlying racial policy. So, racial discrimination is inequities, not being on the same footing, by resources, by socioeconomic status, by what you have, by the opportunities you have. It has nothing to do with how you actually view the person. Nothing. Nothing. That's why it's really easy with these definitions to just accuse people of being a racist when there's actually no evidence of what we would consider as racism there. They're operating on two totally different definitions, in two totally different worlds. We are versus the actual social justice movement. So focusing on racial discrimination takes our eyes off of the central agents of racism. Racist policy and racist policy makers are what I call racist power, says Kendi. Here's what he says about this. This is really interesting. But if racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against the individual based on that person's race, the racial discrimination is not inherently racist. The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. Now, isn't that bizarre? That should be very bizarre. So if the way I read that, and I read it multiple times in context, the way I read it is that he's saying that if I'm actually truly racist, like I actually think somebody's inferior to me, but my actions still create equity, I'm actually being an anti-racist. That's bizarre. That's very bizarre.
That's probably used to justify reverse racism.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, it kind of makes sense though in what they're doing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it does. It's very consistent with his definitions, that's for sure.
You give this race all these benefits because obviously you must think that they can't do anything on their own, so you have to do everything for them.
Right.
Well, that's a very racist attitude. Because of color of skin, they'll never achieve anything they're worth. This group of people will never achieve.
It is.
We have to give them everything.
Exactly.
It's racist, but it's creating equity for that. So
Yep. Exactly. A few more quotes. This is the consistent function of racist ideas and of any kind of bigotry more broadly, to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare them. So again, consistent here. It's not about the people. It's not about the individual. It's not about what they've done. It's not about what they believe. It's all about the policy. All about the policy. Denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies, races, and nations. It is beating within us. So, if you deny that racism exists, if you deny that you are racist, you are proving your racism, obviously. Here's an interesting quote. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. So he leaves no room for being neutral. He leaves no room for saying, I'm not a racist. You have to be an anti-racist, which comes along with it. You have to do the work of anti-racism. There's no passive position. If you're not a racist, you're an anti-racist, which necessarily requires you to do the work of anti-racism. Big quote. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problems in powers and policies as an anti-racist. So again, look at those postmodern themes. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. This may seem harsh, but it's important at the outset that we apply one of the core principles of anti-racism, which is to return the word racist itself back to its proper usage. Racist is not, as Richard Spencer argues, a pejorative. It is not the worst word in the English language. It is not the equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive. And the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. Again, deconstruction, dismantle it, dismantle language. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive term into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. So he's all about the action. It's married to this ideology. That's why you feel, and people have felt, this overwhelming pressure to be active on social media, to post black squares, to do hashtag Black Lives Matter. It's so intertwined in a part of the ideology that to not do that work and to not be active on social media is to not be an anti-racist. And if you're not an anti-racist, what are you? You're a racist. So we have to understand this. That's why when you see Christians doing those things, you go, what are you doing? And maybe some of you did some of those things, and probably in ignorance. But again, we're learning, so that's good. The common idea of claiming colorblindness is akin to the notion of being not racist. So colorblindness is racist. As with the not racist, the colorblind individual, by ostensibly failing to see race, fails to see racism and falls into racist passivity. The language of colorblindness, like the language of not racist, is a mask to hide racism. This is interesting. Remember from our little survey of biblical theology, so to Kendi, the language of Colossians 3 and Galatians 3 would be colorblind. Kendi's idea fails the Scythian test. If you remember, Scythian, there's neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, Scythian, barbarian, but all are one in Christ. So this new man where we don't worry or care about those things. We're all one. That's racist to Kendi, obviously. Fails the Scythian test. His idea does. This is really interesting. Here's very practical now. Do-nothing climate policy is racist policy, since the predominantly non-white global South is being victimized by climate change more than the wider global North, even as the wider global North is contributing more to its acceleration. Crazy. Like, wow. Notice the victim, non-victim categories. They're always going to be there. Notice how environmental climate realities must be equalized, which is impossible. Like, think of Tower of Babel. God spread these nations that he created around the world. He didn't put them all in the same spot. He didn't give them all the same climate. Like, look at the Eskimos. They live on ice and they eat fish. Like, I don't even know what else to say. Also, notice how Kendi assumes climate change is real without providing any scientific research to back up his claim. So you wouldn't know that because you didn't read the book, but maybe some of you did, I don't know. He has 0 footnotes. 0. If you know anything about academic writing, you cite everything. You have to. Like, you always have to be citing, like, this isn't just my own idea, this is backed up with this, 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 and this. Like, that's central to academic writing. He has 0 footnotes. He makes a claim like climate change and the racism of passive climate change policy or whatever. 0 citations, 0 footnotes, 0 research to back it up. It's his own idea.
Well, do you think that when they continue to make statements like that, they continue to repeat it over and over and over again until people start to say, well, that must be true?
Yep.
Everybody's spraying it around.
Exactly, and they get in an echo chamber. And so what happens is you got this group of these people who are promoting this ideology, and they all cite each other then. And so they just get in this echo chamber. It's like, oh, Bell cites Crenshaw. Oh, Crenshaw cites Kendi. Oh, Robin DiAngelo cites Crenshaw. Oh, Crenshaw, it's just back and forth, and it's this echo chamber. And they're all just saying the same things, and they're citing each other, and they don't have any citations outside of it, and they rarely ever cite anything that's actually of real scientific substance, that's actually like good research and good science. And when some things come out that are good research and good science that goes against their ideology, they cancel it. And I have an example here coming up of good research that was done on some of these disparities that were being claimed, and they found that, there actually is no disparity. That was bad research, and we just did the good research. True stories, like professors are getting fired from their positions for even citing those articles. It's crazy. Here's a nice little chart. Becoming anti-racist. So the fear zone, deny racism is a problem. I avoid hard questions. I strive to be comfortable. I talk to others who look and think like me. The learning zone, listen to others who think and look differently than me. I am vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps. Again, think of local knowledge there. I education myself. I educate myself. I didn't make this, so... But I have my own typos, so I can't really be too critical. I educate myself about race and structural racism. Again, structural racism, not true racism. I understand my own privileges in ignoring racism. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I recognize racism as present and current problem. Growth zone. I identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. That's a big one. Like, I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. That's why it's like universally, if you're an anti-racist, you are voting Democrat. Because they're the ones that pay lip service to this work, even if they don't actually really do anything about it. I sit with my discomfort. I speak when I see racism in action. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession. Again, there's action. You got to be vocal. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized. Another big one. It does not matter. Maybe you've heard it recently. A few months ago, it came out that I think it was United Airlines decided that by a certain date they were going to have 50% of their pilots racial minorities. Well, how do you make that goal? Because there are certain benchmarks that you have to meet in order to be a pilot. And I don't want to fly United if I know that this person was only solely hired by the color of their skin and not because they're actually qualified to fly this plane. Like, that's crazy. So, again, yielding positions of power. Doesn't matter if you're qualified or whatever. Doesn't matter if you're actually competent. If you're white, you got to yield the positions of power. I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. We're not doing that right now. Which, again, it doesn't take into account demographics. Like, simple as that. Like, if you're in a place that there just is 95% white people, you can't expect there to be these ratios in groups like this or in churches or whatever that would totally blow that out of the water. Like, you just can't do that. But nonetheless, yep.
Elizabeth and I had actually seen that article about the United thing. I just double-checked it. It's actually women and people of color. So
Oh, there we go. More intersections.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. So, disparities and inequities. We're going to look at this a little bit more. Here's some, I'm going to list a few inequities that Kendi lists are big ones in society. The first one is this. Again, he offers no citations for this. So this is just him saying that this is a stat. He doesn't actually have research to back it up. That he cites. Maybe he does. I don't know why he wouldn't have cited it if he does. 71% of white families lived in owner-occupied homes in 2014, compared to 45% of, what is it, Latinx?
yeah, it's supposed to be Latino. So like instead of Latino, it has an X, so it's gender neutral.
Oh, Latinx families and 41% of black families. So that's a big one for Kendi. And that actually might be true. That's probably actually a true stat. But again, Kendi says that racial equity would be if the percentages of all three were relatively the same and nearing the 70s or even 90s. So let's just say that 70% of people from every single racial group are lived in owner-occupied homes. But again, no questions are asked about the decisions that somebody is making that might lead them to be able to own their own home. And that's not part of it. It's all about the policy. What policies are keeping this from being realized, this goal of complete equality in that regard?
So their approach would not be to try to solve the underlying problems of that are affecting those communities. It would be to create government programs
Yep.
that
Yep. So put policymakers in place, elect policymakers that will pass policy that will, yep,
basically
give houses away. Yep, exactly. Because you can't actually create this any other way than that. White lives matter to the tune of 3.5 additional years over black lives in the United States. Kendi says that. That's actually probably true as well. But again, doesn't take into account decisions. Doesn't take into account like gang violence in the inner city and how many blacks are killing blacks. I wonder, I don't know if the abortion statistic is lumped into this. I don't know. That would be interesting if it was, because then that would be crazy.
is this referring to lifespan?
Yes, so abortion wouldn't be in that one. This one it might be, though. Black infants die at twice the rate of white infants. He just says that. Now, if he is including, like, he says infants, so I'm assuming he means living, like a child that's born. So I would assume. But again, doesn't take into account any decisions. It's just observations. This is one that I didn't get from Kendi. He probably brings it up in his book. But this one is actually widely talked about. This is like the one all over the place. I pulled this one from Voddie's book, but the police are 2.5 times more likely to shoot and kill a black man than a white man. So that's the big one going around. We're going to look at that one a little bit more specifically. So, I shouldn't have that out there yet, but okay, ignore that last one. A closer look at 2.51 stat. correlation is not causation. Maybe you've heard this if you've done some research classes or some science classes. When we do research, we're trying to figure out what is the cause of this thing that I'm observing. There could be things that are correlated with a cause that we don't know yet. And so the thing that might be reported to be the cause, it might actually just be a product of the true cause that we haven't discovered yet. And so that's a whole part of science and doing research where you try to, figure out, only test one factor so you know if it's actually a correlation or if it's actually causing something. So univariate analysis is often misleading, and that's what this stat is. It's a univariate analysis. So the best seen in the wage gap debate. So the idea of we're going to take the amount of money that men make, we're going to take the amount of money women make, and we're going to compare them, and that's the only variant that we are going to consider, the only factor that we're going to consider, even though there's probably 50 more factors that actually feed into how much money you make. And so univariate analysis is often misleading, and that's what this stat is. It's from a univariate analysis. So the solution is to use race-specific violent crime as a benchmark. This was articulated in a famous paper. And this is a quote from that paper. When violent crime is used as a benchmark, anti-black disparities in FOIS, which is fatal officer-involved shootings, disappear or even reverse. And so Bauckham says, in commenting on that, he says, in other words, it is white people who are actually shot at a disproportionately high rates when the number of interactions with police is tallied up. So you take into account people who have guns, the criminals who have guns, or and are actually violent in this interaction, and you take into account how many times they actually interact with a police officer, and you find that it's actually just somewhat disproportionate that whites, with the number of interactions they have with police officers, are actually getting shot more. So, now this is really interesting. So this study, this is the study that I was mentioning. It was attacked immediately as racist. One researcher was demoted from his position at Michigan State for even citing it, not just being a part of the research. Eventually, the authors retracted the study, probably because they couldn't handle the pressure, though it was peer-reviewed, and they still stand behind their findings. Moreover, the findings mirror those of a similar study in 2015. So, again, any research like this is instantly canceled and deemed racist, and it's not tolerated in the academy anymore. So, the irony of disparity and inequity. This isn't necessarily directly related, but it's kind of related. It's this idea that we all have, you could say, disparities dependent on the groups we identify with. And this is a funny quote about the disparity that men actually can be considered oppressed in a lot of ways, even though they are the ultimate oppressor. Here's what it says. The emerging list of men's grievances are legion. With respect to the criminal justice system, men have a lower chance of positing bail than women. Men go to prison at a higher rate and are treated worse in prison than are women. Men are punished more harshly for the same crimes. Men have higher rates of solitary confinement and more severe, men serve a higher percentage of their prison sentence. With respect to divorce adjusted for income, men make higher alimony payments, and men receive a lower rate of custody of children after divorce. With respect to education, men underachieve in K through 12, and men attend college at a lower rate and graduate at a lower rate. With respect to death, men are 20 times more likely to die in a work-related injury. Men have a higher rate of suicide, and men are more likely to die from violent gun and knife crime. With respect to physical violence, men endure a higher rate of corporal punishment in childhood. With respect to war, men are forced by law and by societal pressure to fight and die in war. Male gendericide has been practiced throughout history as a way of subduing populations. And as veterans, men suffer higher rates of homelessness, suicide, PTSD, and drug addiction. With respect to employment, men are forced to work for a pay in capitalist economy more than are women. Women are concerned with breaking through the glass ceiling, yet almost all of the thankless work done below ground in mining, utilities, fishing, and excavation is done by men. So, it's funny because a lot of these disparities that we see are for a good reason, though. Like, for instance, the war disparity, there should be a great disparity there. I mean, I would come from the position that no women should be going and fighting a war. There should be a drastic disparity there, and that's good, and that's right, and that's biblical. So you can't just say and look at just disparities arbitrarily and just say that this all needs to be equalized. Like, some of these disparities are actually right and biblical. And part of it, too, is like, of course men are arrested more and serve longer sentences and are put in solitary confinement more, because men have testosterone and they're going to be a little bit more violent than women in most cases. Like, it's obvious. That's not actually a disparity that we need to worry about or be like, that's somehow unjust. So this is all about the irony of it. It's just like the same things can be said of the disparities we see among racial groups. A lot of them can be easily explained by decisions that people make. And they're not just arbitrarily assigned to or a product of a racist policy. Economic inequity, the solution. Now, this is really interesting. This is really interesting stuff. The solution. So this is coming from more of a Christian side of things here. So how do we actually solve this problem? Allen, W.B. Allen, he's black, so God did not promise to provide material security. Remember, we talked about this in our first lecture. God did not promise to provide material security. He promised, rather, to reward the effort to merit material security, while endowing us from the beginning with the power to exert such effort. Made Adam able to work. He put him in the garden. He said, work, cultivated it. And it produced fruit. So, work, you're going to get a reward. That's how God created the universe, the world. So the solution to economic hardship is the individual's decision to cultivate the earth. Thus, societies and nations which allow an individual the freedom to labor and cultivate by his own initiative are leaning into the biblical framework. So that would mean that societies that don't allow an individual to take that initiative and work are actually promoting poverty. And so more socialistic countries are promoting poverty. Because how do you get out of poverty? You get out of poverty by taking initiative and working. And God created a universe and a world where if you do apply yourself to work and you're freed up to do it and you're not restricted, you will actually be blessed. You will actually get food. You will actually have what you need. That's how He created the world. And so work is fundamental. It's good. It's a pre-fall ordained thing. It's before even sin. So again, that's why socialistic worlds or socialistic countries we should be very against them, because they're not biblical and they do not promote actual economic flourishing. They create poverty. So obviously, you might ask the question, well, what if somebody doesn't obviously have the ability to cultivate the earth, to work? And again, we talked about this with 2 Thessalonians 4. I remember I gave that analogy of, when I was in Ethiopia, and all these little boys were running up to us and asking us for money. And the guy that I was with, the Egyptian who grew up in Africa, said, go get a job, go get a job, go get a job. You can work. You're able. And then the guy that was severely disabled, who had barely, didn't really have any legs at all and just crawled on the sidewalk, he gave him money. And he tells me, I gave him money because he can't work. So that's how we think about those things. Who do we provide for? And again, how do we provide? We provide by charity, by mercy. The church, obviously, and the religious institutions, they have the jurisdiction to distribute resources in that way, not the state, not the government. So that's how we provide for people that aren't able. But if you're able, you should be in a society, you want to be in a society where if you're able, you can actually apply yourself and work. It's fundamental to how God created the world. So economics and the free market are colorblind. This is important to realize. Again, obviously, we know that they don't like the social justice movement doesn't like this idea of colorblind. But the reality is economics is colorblind. This is an idea from Allen. So think about it this way. Thus, when individuals are given the freedom to participate in the free market, it creates wealth regardless of skin color, because people want to make money. It's the way it is. If somebody of a different color comes up to you and say, hey, I want to buy what you're selling, sure, I'll take your money. I'm in it to make money. Economics just really is colorblind. So poverty is perpetuated by slothfulness, laziness, and victim mentality. Again, 2 Thessalonians 3. Poverty is perpetuated by increasing government control of resources. Look at Venezuela. Look at Cuba. Look at North Korea right now. It's more socialistic. Where do you see a ton of poverty? In those countries. Starvation. Venezuela is the craziest of things because they have so much resources, it's out of control. Oil, food, agriculture, everything they have. They have precious metals, they have diamonds, they got everything, and they are starving. Why? Because they're socialistic. It's as simple as that. Their government has not allowed the person to apply themselves to work freely. So the paradox then is that presumptions about what is needed for black progress are the very things that stymie black progress. That's a quote from Allen. The paradox then is that presumptions about what is needed for black progress are the very things that stymie black progress. So this is a very interesting thing. In addressing Jim Crow laws, Allen says the reason such laws were required in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Georgia. Again, Jim Crow laws were objectively racist from how we would define racism. That's true. So addressing Jim Crow laws, Allen says the reason such laws were required in these states and elsewhere were precisely because the market operating in the absence of restraint would not sustain segregation. The emergence of Jim Crow, therefore, constitutes prima facie evidence of economic conditions otherwise favorable to effective participation in the market by American blacks. So the free market system works so well that unless you have something racist like Jim Crow to keep people down, the black population is going to flourish as they were starting to flourish. Even right after, slavery was abolished. It's incredible. I have some quotes from that as well. So Allen actually argues that it is an entire fiction that black people today still feel the pains of the past. He argues that. He says, race has long been a problem in the United States in ways adequately explained in various technical writing. It has not, however, been proven that race is an integral part of American culture. It is a logical error to confuse what is pervasive with what is integral. And it is a moral error to derive necessary conclusions from accidental determinants. The conclusion that racism is intrinsic or integral to American principles constitutes such a moral error. So black leaders have turned to group identity rather than to individual identity and American principles of assimilation. So that's the problem. It's postmodernism. It's group identity over individual identity. He says this, in the scanty 25 years since 1865, the war's end, the population of blacks in the United States had virtually doubled, 4 million to 8 million. Incredible. Moreover, the natural increase had been accompanied by extensive accomplishments in educational, agricultural, and industrial and cultural development. Census reports demonstrate in considerable detail a portrait of solid participation in the economy. They do so, however, against the backdrop of the outrages upon the Negro in this country. So, even within the 25 years after the war ended, and blacks were they were having freedom to start to apply themselves in the free market, they experienced tremendous economic growth. They doubled in population. It was incredible. Even among the fact that there were still a lot of true racists in America, which is incredible. So even with still real pressure, true racist pressure, they were still seeing this incredible flourishing because of the free market and because of hard work, because of taking initiative individually. Frederick Douglass, you probably know him, obviously a famous black man in the late 1800s who talked a lot about this idea of race in his book, The Reason Why. As to the increased resistance this is a large quote, so this is going to be a couple pages, but it's really, really good. As to the increased resistance met with of late, so again, he's talking about this resistance that's, you think of Jim Crow type resistance, but I think this was a little bit before that, but still there's obviously a lot of truly racist people in the country. So as to the increased resistance met with of late, let us use a little philosophy. It is best to account in a hopeful way for this reaction and even to read it as a favorable symptom. It is a proof that the Negro is not standing still. He is not dead, but alive and active. He is not drifting with the current, but manfully resisting it and fighting his way to better conditions than those of the past, and better than those which popular opinion prescribes for him. He is not contented with his surroundings, but wholly dares to break away from the path and hew out a way of safety and happiness for himself in defiance of all opposing forces. The enemies of the Negro say that he is making progress, and they naturally wish to stop him and keep him in just what they consider his proper place. But the Negro has said, has said it decided not to all of this and is now by industry, economy, and education wisely raising himself to the conditions of civilization and comparative well-being beyond anything formerly thought possible for him. What the Negro has to do then is to cultivate a courageous and cheerful spirit, use philosophy and exercise patience. He must embrace every avenue open to him for the acquisition of wealth. He must educate his children and build up a character of industry, economy, intelligence, and virtue. Next to victory is the glory and happiness of manfully contending for it. Our situation demands faith in ourselves, faith in the power of truth, faith in work, and faith in the influence of manly character. So these things aren't localized, or these things aren't just for black people. Like anybody in an impoverished state who applies these principles and who applies a good work ethic and working hard will see blessing, because that's the world that God created. So this isn't just specifically a black thing. This would be true of any person, individual person, who found themselves in a bad situation, who wants to work out of it. These things are very much universal.
I think there's a key line in there.
Yeah, I'll go back.
It says about, he must embrace every avenue and open them up to the acquisition of them. He must educate his children and build up character in industry and economy.
Yep.
We're in such a self-centered society that people just want, I want it for me. I don't care about my kids. I want
Right.
it for me.
Yeah.
You know, I want everything.
That's a huge one.
And I don't care if I have to pay for my kids' school. I made on my own. They can do it themselves. And there's no
Right.
care for children.
Right. Exactly. Big, big, big one.
Perpetuates itself.
Yep. Huge. Booker T. Washington, another black guy that obviously worked in the late 1800s, early 1900s on this issue of racism. He says, a freedom from dependence on others, labor to the independent or self-labor, freedom to transform unused and dwarfed hands into skilled and productive hands, to change labor from drudgery into that which is dignified and glorified, to change local commerce into trade with the world, to change the Negro from an ignorant man into an intelligent man, to change sympathies that were local and narrow into love and goodwill for all mankind, freedom to change stagnation into growth, weakness into power. Yea to us all, your race and mine, Lincoln has been a great emancipator. It's talking about Lincoln. This was at the Abraham Lincoln Memorial Address in Philadelphia on February 14, 1899. He goes on to say, in a different address, this was on February 22nd, 1903, at the Educational and Industrial Emancipation of the, he said this in an article called The Educational and Industrial Emancipation of the Negro. He goes, those are most truly free today who have passed through great discipline, those persons in the United States who are most truly free in body, mind, morals, and those who have passed through the most severe training, those who have exercised the most patience and, at the same time, the most dogged persistence and determination to deal more practically and directly with the affairs of my own race. I believe that both the teachings of history as well as the results of everyday observation should convince us that we shall make our most enduring progress by laying the foundation carefully, patiently in the ownership of the soil, the exercise of habits of economy, the saving of money, the securing of the most complete education of hand and head, and the cultivation of Christian virtue. I repeat here what I have often said in the South: the Negro seeks no special privileges. All that he asks is opportunity, that the same law which is made by the white man and applied to the one race be applied with equal certainty and exactness to the other. This is a very Christian way of talking about justice, because he is a Christian, obviously. So this was actually like, these were, you could still say, the civil rights leaders in the time immediately after the, emancipation. Really good stuff. This is good. This is right. This is the way to think about it. And it actually created change. And it did. It truly did. And it created, wonderful things. And then, obviously, we start to see the rise of Marxist ideology. We start to see the rise of postmodernism. And now it gets applied to this whole idea of racial inequity. And that's when we start to see the drift, the regression back away from the good growth that was being experienced in America. Allen says this: we have presumed instead that what becomes of a man or a woman depends upon what society will do for him or her. As a consequence, the natural and necessary instruments of peace and prosperity are are systematically disregarded in favor of constructivist attempts to remake humanity by governmental means. It's exactly what's going on right now. Okay, we're going to quick run through some more definitions. This is on these definitions that have to do with white stuff. So, whiteness. I think that should just be a set of normative privileges granted. I have a lot of typos, I've noticed. A set of normative privileges granted to white-skinned individuals and groups which is invisible to those privileged by it. White privilege, a series of unearned advantages that accrue to white people by virtue of their whiteness. Unearned advantages that accrue to white people by virtue of their whiteness. Peggy McIntosh, in her article, her famous article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Very famous article, all about white privilege. She says this, I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. So I have begun in an untutored way to ask what it is like to have white privilege. I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. Okay, we're going to look at Paul here. We're going to read a lot of scripture. Here we go. He's talking about boasting. But we will not boast beyond limits, but we will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us, to reach even to you, for we are not overextending ourselves as though we did not reach you. Paul is writing to the Corinthians, obviously. They're accusing him of being lazy, double-minded. There's these super apostles plaguing the Corinthian church, and they are putting out their resume. Look how much influence we got. Look how much knowledge we have. Look how much money we have. And look how much we are flourishing. And they look at Paul, and he's this weak, he's imprisoned, he's beat up, and they're questioning his apostleship. And so he's talking about the things that you should be boasting in, not these things that the super apostles were boasting in. But nonetheless, notice again that the area of influence God assigned to us. Again, God assigns these things. And remember the parable of the talents too. And then we're going to jump. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What am I saying with this boastful confidence? I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were weak. We were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. He's talking about these super apostles. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. Am I talking like a madman? Far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and of often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, less than one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day. I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? Am I not weak? Who is made to fall? Am I not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. This is funny. I know a man in Christ, he's talking about himself, who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So Paul lists out a bunch of privileges and things that might be even considered not privileges, oppressive things. But he actually considers them privileges. He says these things that would be deemed by society as privileges, being a Jew, being an Israelite, basically, he says in other places, the Pharisee of Pharisees, like, as to the law, blameless, perfect. He had the ultimate privilege. And one, he's like, I'm not boasting in that stuff. I'm boasting in the shipwrecks, the beatings, those things. Like, the Christian has great privilege in persecution and suffering. There is such a thing as privilege. It exists. It's actually true. But it's a little bit different than how the world would think about it, obviously. And here's the best one. You remember what Peggy McIntosh said? What did she say here? She thinks of it as a knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. I think that's great, because here, let's listen to what Paul does here. In Acts. Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion, who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes," the tribune answered. "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So Paul pulled out his passport. He goes, "I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do this. This is illegal." Was that sinful for him to do? No. He was born a Roman citizen. He didn't choose it. He didn't merit it. It was God ordained for a very specific purpose. We see a very obvious application of it right here, and it's good. So we got to think about this whole idea of privilege in that context. We all have privileges, every single one of us, in very unique ways, unlike anybody else, and they're not just relative to your white skin or whatever. There are plenty of black people who have tremendous privilege. Think about just genetic privilege too. Like LeBron James, think about what he was able to, how much wealth he was able to incur because he is a freak athlete and has an incredible body. Like, that's privilege. It's privilege. And so everybody has certain privileges. They might lack other privileges that others have. Just physical appearance is one of those things. Again, all these things that we said originally are God-ordained disparities. God ordains where you're born, who you're born to, how much money, what kind of family are you born into, what kind of intellect do you have, your raw potential for intellect. Like, those things, God ordains them. They might be privileges. It's not that you have privileges or don't have privileges, it's how are you going to use them? Are you going to glorify God with them? Or are you going to steward them well, or are you going to be an unfaithful steward? That's the question, and that's the question that the social justice movement is not asking. They're not even thinking about it. They don't even care because they're not Christian. Okay. More definitions. White supremacy. Any belief, behavior, or system that supports, promotes, or enhances white privilege. Here is a nice chart. This has been in the news very recently, this week. This was leaked from some Iowa public school district that this was part of their curriculum. Fox News ran a story on it. PragerU ran a story on it. I'm sure many others did. But you have the overt white supremacy, so socially unacceptable. This is the stuff that, again, like, this is the obvious stuff, but most of the most of the racism that takes place and white supremacy that takes place in a society is actually this covert stuff, the stuff that, you don't see. It's kind of just ingrained in you. So the overt stuff, you've probably you're reading it right now: lynching, hate crimes, swastikas, KKK, burning crosses, the N-word, racial slurs, racist jokes, and neo-Nazis. Notice that, again, this is tiered, so the stuff at the very bottom of the triangle is like the least of the white privilege type stuff. The stuff closer to the line is, again, almost about to cross over into overt white supremacy. Make America Great Again, that line is almost to the point of being overtly white supremacist, which is interesting. Because there's a lot of people who say that slogan and have zero intention of having it be anything about race at all. They might have totally different ideas behind what that means. So that's a very interesting thing. Again, obviously look at denial of racism. That's in the covert white supremacy, denial of white privilege, whatever. You can read through it. You can go back, watch the video, read it over it again. But this was just in the news. A few more definitions. White complicity. White people, through the practices of whiteness and by benefiting from, I always mess it up, from white privilege, contribute to the maintenance of systemic racial injustice. So, this is a quote from Barbara Applebaum in her article or book, Being White, Being Good, White Complicity, White Moral Responsibility and Social Justice Pedagogy. The white complicity claim maintains that all whites are complicit in the systemic racial injustice. This sometimes takes the form of the mantra, all whites are racist. When white complicity takes the latter configuration and implies not that all whites are racially prejudiced, but rather that all whites participate in and often unwittingly maintain the racist system of which they are part and from which they benefit. White equilibrium, the belief system that allows white people to remain comfortably ignorant. I think I have a typo in every single definition. That's what happens when you're a bad typer. D'Angelo, in her book White Fragility, says this: white equilibrium is a cocoon of racial comfort, centrality, superiority, entitlement, racial apathy, and obliviousness, all rooted in an identity of being good people free of racism. Challenging this cocoon throws off our racial balance, because being racially off balance is so rare. We have not had to build the capacity to sustain the discomfort. Thus, whites find these challenges unbearable and want them to stop. White fragility, obviously.
That's why the movement's able to go so fast, because they get called racist, they just find it unbearable, and they'll do anything to not have that label attached.
Right. Exactly. So White Fragility, this is obviously the name of her book. This is her whole big idea that she promoted, the inability and unwillingness. So this is Baucham's definition of it, but we'll look at a quote of, well, he might actually quote her, I don't know. The inability and unwillingness of white people to talk about race due to the grip that whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, white complicity, and white equilibrium exert on them, knowingly or unknowingly. D'Angelo says this: though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. Okay, last slide, and then we're done. This is really a culmination of it all, and this is how, I'm going to put it up here in just a second. This is basically a chart that I screenshotted. I stole from John Harris. He gave a podcast episode, man, it was probably over a year ago now, called "Why Are All My Friends Marxists?" and forming a new religion. So we start to see these things categorized. So how social justice parallels the gospel. So white, male, straight privilege, that is the original sin. So to be white, to be male, to be straight, that's your original sin. Political correctness, that's the law. Woke is being born again. Liberal politics, that's the sacraments. Woke leaders are the priests. Sociology is the canon. Equality is heaven. And victims are the saints. So how social justice contradicts the gospel. Focus. External behaviors instead of heart condition. Very obvious. Very obvious. The group. Oppressor classes instead of individuals. Very obvious. Order. Sanctification precedes justification. It's totally meriting. You have to do this work of anti-racism. You have to merit this, but you'll actually never get there, because racism is so structural, so systemic that it's a cancer in your bones, and you'll never actually not be a racist if you're white. You just can't escape it. You have to continually do the work.
One of the previous tenets has white savior complex. So if you're a white person who's anti-racist, you're still racist because you have a white savior complex.
Yeah.
So there's no win.
Yeah, there is no win. It's totally horrible. Power, perpetual repentance instead of justification. Okay, so that's the last slide.